The morning Matilda Bristol rode into Dusty Creek, Texas. The sun was already angry, hammering down on the cracked earth like it had a personal grievance against every living thing beneath it. And she had a loaded pistol on her hip, a ledger in her saddlebag, and absolutely no intention of leaving without the $240 that Homer Malone owed her employer. It was the spring of 1874, and Dusty Creek was the kind of town that existed on the map only because someone had been too stubborn or too tired to move on. The main street was a single long stretch of sun-bleached timber storefronts, a livery stable at one end and a saloon at the other, with a barber shop, a general store, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a jail that looked like it had never once held anyone longer than a night. Cattle country surrounded it on all sides, the flat grasslands rippling in the heat, and the distant red rock mesas gave the whole landscape a kind of savage, unforgiving beauty that Matilda had come to respect over the years. She had spent riding for Amos Pierce and his debt collection agency out of San Antonio. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, with gray eyes that people sometimes described as the color of rain clouds and other times the color of steel, depending on what kind of mood she was in when she looked at them. She wore a practical riding skirt of dark wool, a white blouse already damp at the collar from the heat, and boots that had seen 1,000 miles of Texas dust. She was not beautiful in the soft, parlor-room way that dime novels celebrated, but she was striking in the way that the landscape was striking, all angles and endurance, with a mouth that could be generous when she chose, and a jaw that told you plainly when she had made up her mind about something. Amos Pierce had sent her because he always sent her when the debtor was stubborn, and the situation required finesse alongside firmness. She had a way of making people understand that paying was simply the more intelligent option. She had collected on 47 debts in 3 years, and not once had she needed to fire that pistol. She was proud of that record in the quiet, private way she was proud of most things. Homer Malone had borrowed $240 from the Pierce Lending Company 18 months ago to expand his cattle operation, had made 3 payments, and then gone silent. Letters had gone unanswered. The previous collector, a heavyset man named Garrett, had ridden out 4 months ago and returned without the money, claiming Malone had run him off with a shotgun. Amos had looked at Matilda across his wide mahogany desk and said, with the particular confidence he reserved for situations he considered solved, "Go get my money, Matilda." She had packed her saddlebag, saddled her bay mare, Clover, and ridden north and west for 4 days. Now she tied Clover to the rail outside the general store and went inside to ask directions to the Malone property. The man behind the counter was old, with a white beard and the permanently squinting expression of someone who had spent 40 years looking into the sun. He told her the Malone spread was about 6 miles east. Follow the creek bed until you see the cottonwood grove, turn south, and you cannot miss the house. He said this in a perfectly ordinary tone, but then he paused and looked at her with something that was not quite concern and not quite curiosity, but somewhere in the middle. "You a relation of his?" he asked. "No," said Matilda, "business." The old man nodded slowly. "He has had a time of it," he said. "I would not be too hard on the man." Matilda thanked him, bought a canteen of water and a small paper bag of dried apricots for the ride, and left without asking what he meant, because in her experience, everyone who owed money had a story about why they owed it, and the story was almost never her concern. Her concern was the ledger figure, and getting it settled. The ride out to the Malone property took her just over an hour because the creek bed was meandering, and the cottonwood grove was further along than she expected. When she finally crested a low rise and saw the spread below her, she pulled Clover up and studied it for a long moment. It was not what she had expected. The property was sizable, a solid 2-story house built from limestone and timber, a large barn, several outbuildings, and a working corral where a half-dozen horses moved in the afternoon heat. The fences were in good repair. The garden beside the house was tended. None of it looked like the property of a man who could not pay his debts, which meant he was choosing not to, and that was the kind of debtor Matilda liked least. She rode down the rise at an easy pace, keeping her posture open and her hands visible, because riding onto a man's property in Texas in 1874 with anything resembling a tense or aggressive posture was a good way to get yourself shot at from a second-story window before you had a chance to introduce yourself. She was 20 yards from the front gate when the man came around the side of the barn. He was tall, broader in the shoulder than most men she had dealt with dark brown hair that was a little too long, curling against the back of his neck, and a jaw that carried about 3 days of stubble. He was wearing a collarless work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, dark trousers, and boots caked with red clay. He was carrying a long-handled tool of some kind, something for the garden or the fencing, and he stopped when he saw her and stood very still in the way that men sometimes stood when they were deciding something quickly. He was younger than she had imagined. The ledger at the office had given her nothing personal about him, only the debt amount and the property address. She had pictured, as she usually did, some variation of the same middle-aged, thick-set, weathered type. Homer Malone was perhaps 29 or 30, and he had a face that would have been called handsome if he had ever smiled, which, from the look of him right now, was something he had not done in quite some time. "This is private property," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to carry. "I am aware," said Matilda. She did not dismount yet. "My name is Matilda Bristol. I work for the Pierce Lending Company out of San Antonio. I am here regarding an outstanding debt in the amount of $240. Something moved behind his eyes. It was not surprise. It was closer to resignation, which was a more complicated thing to navigate than anger. "You can tell Pierce I will pay when I am able to pay," he said. "Mr. Pierce has been told that for 6 months through correspondence that you stopped answering 4 months ago," said Matilda. "He sent me to make a more personal arrangement." Homer Malone set the tool he was carrying against the fence post, slowly, deliberately, and turned back to look at her with the full weight of his attention, which she could feel even from 20 yards away. "The man he sent before you pointed a gun at me on my own property," he said. "I asked him to leave. He left." "I have not pointed a gun at you," said Matilda. "And I would not unless you gave me considerable cause." She let a beat of silence pass. "May I dismount? The heat is severe and I have been riding since before dawn." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "There is water at the trough for your horse. You can come inside for water if you want it while I tell you why I cannot pay you today." It was not the response she had anticipated, and she filed that small surprise away carefully as she swung down from Clover and led the mare toward the trough. The inside of the house was cooler than outside, the stone walls doing the work they had been built to do, and it was clean in a sparse, functional way, not the home of a man who lived carelessly. There was a long pine table in the main room, a stone fireplace, bookshelves on the far wall with a genuine collection of volumes, a handful of framed drawings that she recognized as land survey maps. A door at the back led to a kitchen, and through it came the smell of coffee that had been sitting on the stove too long. He poured her a cup without asking and set it on the table, then poured one for himself and sat across from her, and she sat down and opened her ledger and set it between them like a declaration of purpose. "Tell me," she said. He told her. The story came out in the plain, unadorned way of a man who had long since stopped hoping anyone would find it persuasive but felt the truth deserved to be spoken anyway. 18 months ago he had borrowed the money to buy 40 additional head of cattle and to build a new hay barn, both of which he had done. The herd had grown well through the first summer. He had made 3 payments as agreed. Then in October of the previous year, his wife Clara had taken fever. He had paid for 2 doctors, one from Dusty Creek and one he had brought out from San Angelo at considerable additional cost. Clara had died in November, leaving behind a son, James, who was now 4 years old, and a daughter, Pearl, who was 2. The remaining cash from his operation had gone to the doctors, the funeral, and the business of keeping the ranch running through the winter with only himself and one hired hand, a 60-year-old Comanche man named Sable who had worked for him for 5 years. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet except for the distant sound of a child's voice from somewhere behind the house. Matilda looked at the ledger. She looked at the figure. She had heard hard luck stories before, many of them, and the difficult truth of the work she did was that she could not simply forgive every debt because the story behind it was painful. Amos Pierce had lent the money in good faith, and he ran a business, not a charity. But she sat there for a moment longer than usual before she said anything, and that moment told her something about herself that she tucked away without examining. "When do you believe you could make a payment?" she asked. "The spring cattle drive goes to market in late June," he said. "If the prices hold, I could pay the full remaining balance by July." "That is 2 months away," she said. "Yes," he said. She tapped her finger against the edge of the ledger, thinking, "I will need to stay in Dusty Creek until I have something to bring back to Mr. Pierce. He will not accept 2 months' wait without some form of assurance." Homer Malone looked at her, and for the first time something other than resignation moved across his face. Something that might have been, if she was reading it right, a very cautious kind of relief. "The hotel in Dusty Creek has rooms," he said. "I am aware," she said. She closed the ledger, picked up her coffee cup, and finished what was in it, which was terrible but warm and necessary. "I will need to see the herd and the accounts," she said, "so I can write a proper report to Mr. Pierce and request that he extend the collection window." "I can show you the accounts tomorrow morning," he said. "If you want to see the herd, you would need to ride out with Sable and me. We are moving them to the north pasture in the next few days." "I will ride out with you," she said, and the decision surprised her a little as she made it, but she stood by it. The following morning she arrived at the property just after sunrise, and Homer met her at the gate with Sable, who was a lean, quiet man with deep-set eyes and silver-streaked black hair, wearing a battered hat and a flannel shirt. He looked at Matilda with the calm, thorough assessment of someone who had lived long enough to evaluate a person completely in the first 30 seconds and never needed to revise his judgment. He gave a small, unhurried nod and said, "Miss," and that was all. The accounts Homer showed her at the kitchen table were in good order, carefully kept in a ledger that was almost as worn as her own, with every expense and every income recorded in a neat, slanted hand. The ranch was genuinely, clearly solvent in a way that the spring drive would confirm. She studied the figures for a long time, asking questions he answered without evasion, and gradually the picture resolved into something she could bring back to Amos Pierce with a clear conscience. They rode out to see the herd late that morning, the 3 of them, across the flat grass country under a sky that had turned a deep, cloudless blue. Matilda had grown up in Austin and had worked cattle country for 3 years, and she knew a good herd when she saw one. The Malone cattle were solid, healthy animals, well-conditioned from the winter, beginning to fill out on the spring grass. Sable moved through them with a practiced ease that told her everything she needed to know about the quality of the operation. Homer rode beside her, and they did not talk much, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had a weight and texture to it, the way silences between people who are still deciding something about each other tend to have. At the far edge of the north pasture, they stopped to let the horses drink at a stock tank, and Homer took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, looking out over the land with an expression she was beginning to recognize as the particular look of a man who loved what he had built and was terrified of losing it. "You do good work here," she said, because it was true and she saw no reason not to say true things. He looked at her sideways as if the compliment was something unexpected that needed to be inspected before he accepted it. "It was Clara's dream as much as mine," he said. "She picked this land. She said the way the light fell on it in the evening was like nothing she had ever seen." Matilda looked at the land, at the way the afternoon light was already beginning to tilt and warm, turning the grass to gold, and she thought, not for the first time in her life, that a person could be right about a piece of the world and wrong about all manner of other things, or right about everything, and still not get to keep it. "I am sorry about your wife," she said, and she meant it. He put his hat back on and said, "Thank you," in the simple, direct way of someone who had had enough of elaborate condolences. Over the next week, Matilda settled into a routine that she had not entirely planned for. She took a room at the Dusty Creek Hotel, a clean, narrow room with a wash basin and a window that looked out on the main street, and she wrote her report to Amos Pierce, requesting a 60-day extension on the collection, detailing the legitimate circumstances and the verifiable assets, and sent it by the Weekly Post rider. While she waited for Pierce's response, she found herself riding out to the Malone property most mornings. She told herself it was because she needed to maintain contact with the debtor to ensure the arrangement remained on track. This was partially true. It was not entirely true. The children were part of it. James and Pearl were looked after during the workday by a woman from town named Mrs. Dora Finch, a widow of about 50 who came out 3 mornings a week, and who had clearly developed a fierce, protective attachment to both children. Pearl was a small, solemn child with enormous dark eyes who studied Matilda from a safe distance for the first 3 visits, before eventually coming to sit close enough to lean against her leg during the afternoon, without a word, as if proximity had simply been authorized by some internal process. James was loud and physical and curious about everything, and he had his father's dark hair and a gap between his 2 front teeth that made every grin disproportionately charming. Matilda was not a woman who had thought much about children. She had spent her adult life in practical pursuit of practical goals, but something about those 2 small, motherless people on that sun-bright piece of Texas land moved through her careful defenses in a way she was not entirely prepared for. And then there was Homer himself. He was not easy to know. He was reserved in the way of someone who had taken real damage and rebuilt himself around the broken places with something harder and quieter than what had been there before. But he was not cold. He was careful. There was a difference, and Matilda, who had spent 3 years reading people quickly in professional situations, found herself slow and uncertain with him in a way that was both frustrating and oddly engaging. He read. That surprised her. The books on the shelf were not decorative. He had opinions about them. On the 4th morning she came out and found him at the table with a copy of one of the newly popular geological surveys of the Western Territories, and they ended up arguing, pleasantly, about whether the survey's author had actually been to the regions he was describing or was writing from second-hand accounts, and the argument lasted through 2 cups of terrible coffee and arrived at no conclusion, but left both of them in better spirits than they had been at the start of the morning. He cooked, which surprised her more. Not elaborately, but competently, the food of a man who had learned to feed himself and 2 small children without reference to anyone else, and the meals were plain and solid and good. On the 5th day she stayed through the midday meal because Sable had ridden in with a problem regarding one of the fence lines to the east, and the 3 of them were deep in discussion of the logistics when Mrs. Dora Finch set a pot on the table and simply began ladling stew into bowls for all of them, and the matter was settled by the simple fact of food appearing. Sable was a man of very few words but a great deal of presence, and Matilda respected him instinctively and completely. He had been born on the Comanche Plains and had come to work for Homer's father before Homer had taken over the ranch, and his knowledge of the land and the cattle was encyclopedic in the way that only comes from a lifetime of intimate attention. He watched Matilda with those calm, assessing eyes for the first several days, and then on the 6th day he said to her, while they were mending a section of fence together because she had offered and he had not turned down the help, "You are not what I expected from a debt collector." "What did you expect?" she asked. "Garrett," he said, and gave a short, quiet sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the neighborhood of one. "I am reliably told I am an improvement on Garrett," she said. "That is a low ceiling," said Sable, and went back to work. Amos Pierce's response came on the 8th day. She read it at the hotel over breakfast, the thin paper covered in her employer's dense, cramped script. He agreed to the 60-day extension on the condition that Matilda remained at the location to ensure no deterioration of the asset situation, and that she provided weekly reports. He also asked, with the mild, transactional curiosity that was the most personal thing about him, whether she had found the subject cooperative. She wrote back that yes, she had found the subject cooperative, and that the asset situation was stable, and that she would provide weekly reports as requested. She sealed the letter and sent it with the post and went back to her breakfast and did not think carefully about why the prospect of remaining in Dusty Creek for 2 months made her feel something that was not, strictly speaking, professional satisfaction. The spring moved forward in that slow, golden way that Texas springs sometimes manage before summer arrives with its brutal heat and puts an end to pleasantness. The grass grew thick, and the creek ran clear, and the cattle ate well, and Homer's mood, which had been like weather that could go either direction, began to settle into something warmer and more consistent in a way that Matilda noticed and catalogued and did not comment on. They began to take rides together in the early evenings, after the work was done, and the children were in bed under Mrs. Finch's supervision on the evenings she stayed late. This had not been planned either. It had begun when, one evening as Matilda was preparing to ride back to town, Homer had said, with the casual, too-studied tone of a man testing a sentence before he committed to it, "I was going to ride out to the South Ridge to check on the fence, if you have time." And she had time. She found she always had time. The South Ridge looked out over the whole of the Malone property, and a good deal of the surrounding territory, and in the evening light it was exactly as Clara had apparently described it, the kind of view that made a person understand why people made a home somewhere instead of simply passing through. They sat their horses side by side and watched the light change, and one evening Homer talked about how he had come to this land with Clara 8 years ago, both of them 22, with a small inheritance from his father and more confidence than sense, and how they had built everything here year by year, the house first, then the barn, then the herd, and how the years of difficulty had been better than the years of ease because, at least in the difficult times, you knew exactly who you were and what you were made of. Matilda told him, because the evening and the light and his openness seemed to call for a corresponding honesty, that she had taken the work with Pierce because she needed to be useful in a direct, measurable way, and because after the death of her mother in Austin when she was 23, she had found that sitting still in one place made the grief too large to manage, and movement kept it at a workable size. She had not told that to anyone before. She was mildly surprised to hear herself saying it out loud. Homer looked at her in the amber evening light and said, "I understand that," in a quiet voice, and she believed him completely. It was not a declaration. It was not a moment that could be named or categorized. It was something smaller and more essential than that, the kind of mutual recognition that happens between people who have both been alone in particular ways and suddenly, without warning, are not. On the ride back, she noticed that their horses had naturally fallen into step side by side, close enough that her knee and his were nearly touching, and neither of them adjusted the distance, and that fact sat with her through the whole dark ride back to town, and through the night and into the next morning. The trouble came, as trouble generally did, at the worst possible moment, in the middle of a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks into her stay. A man named Delbert Cass arrived in Dusty Creek on a gray horse with 2 companions, and a purposeful set to his shoulders that Matilda recognized from the hotel window as the posture of someone who had come to settle something unpleasant. She would not have given it more than a passing thought, except that she heard his name mentioned at the general store that afternoon, and the old man behind the counter went quiet in a specific way that told her the name carried weight she did not yet understand. She asked around carefully over the rest of that day and assembled the picture by evening. Delbert Cass was a land agent of the aggressive variety, the kind that had been proliferating across Texas since the war, men who operated in the space between law and lawlessness and used money and threat in roughly equal measure. He had been trying to purchase the Malone property for 2 years, and Homer had refused him twice. Cass had apparently suggested, on the second refusal, that the Malone debt situation might provide a more persuasive argument than cash. He was not wrong that the debt was a vulnerability. And now he had ridden into town on the same week that Matilda's presence reminded everyone that the debt was real and outstanding. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the narrow hotel bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the Pierce extension letter in her saddlebag and the ledger with its figures, and what those figures meant to the man, and the 2 small children in the limestone house 6 miles east of where she was lying. She had a duty to Amos Pierce. She had a professional obligation to the collection. She had no obligation, none at all, to protect Homer Malone from a land agent's machinations. She got up before dawn, dressed, and went to find Delbert Cass. He was breakfasting at the saloon, which served food in the mornings. He was a compact, well-dressed man of about 45, with a neatly trimmed beard and the carefully friendly manner of someone who had learned that aggression worked better when it was wrapped in pleasantness. He looked up when she sat down across from him without invitation, and the pleasantness arranged itself into something watchful. "You are the collector from Pierce," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. "Then we have mutual interests," he said. "I have offered to purchase the Malone note from Pierce at a premium. If the debt is called immediately, Malone has no means to pay it and the property goes to settlement. I will purchase the property at a fair market price and everyone benefits." "Mr. Pierce has extended the collection window," said Matilda. "The note will be paid in full by July." Cass looked at her pleasantly. "I understand that is the current arrangement," he said. "Arrangements can change." "They can," said Matilda, "but they will not change in the direction you are describing." She kept her voice level and her hands flat on the table, because she had learned long ago that the surest way to lose a negotiation was to let the other party see any agitation. "Mr. Pierce extended this window on my professional assessment of the situation. I am the agent on this collection and my report stands. If you want to purchase the note from Pierce, you are welcome to ride to San Antonio and make that offer. I suspect he will tell you no, because collecting full interest on a performing debt is more profitable than selling the note at a discount. But you are welcome to try." Cass looked at her for a long moment with eyes that were pale and very still. "You are loyal to the debtor," he said mildly. "That is unusual in your profession." "I am loyal to my professional judgment," said Matilda. "Which is that the Malone property is a functioning, profitable operation that will satisfy the debt in full within 60 days. Calling the note early for any reason other than genuine default would be predatory and would expose Mr. Pierce to reputational harm in the community. I will make that argument to him very clearly if you approach him." She stood up because the conversation was over, and she looked down at Delbert Cass for a moment and said, "Have a pleasant breakfast," and walked out into the early morning. Her hands, she noticed when she reached the street, were not quite steady. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed in the cool morning air and told herself it was the adrenaline of a sharp professional negotiation. She told herself this 3 or 4 times, firmly, until she mostly believed it. She rode out to the Malone property that morning and found Homer in the barn, working with Sable on the preparation of the horses for the coming drive. She did not immediately tell him about Cass because she wanted to think about how to present it, and she spent the morning helping Pearl arrange a collection of small stones in the garden by color and size, which Pearl appeared to consider a matter of considerable importance, and thinking. She told him at the midday meal, when the children had been settled down for their rest and Sable had ridden out to check the east pasture. She laid it out plainly, what Cass had said and what she had said back to him, and she watched Homer's face as she spoke with the particular attentiveness she now could not seem to turn off around him. His expression went through several things quickly. Anger first, the kind that is mostly fear wearing a harder face, then something that was close to shame. Then, as she finished and he understood the full shape of what she had done that morning, something quieter and more searching. "You told him the arrangement would stand," he said. "Yes," she said. "That was not nothing," he said. "A man like Cass does not take interference lightly." "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he asked. The question was simple and genuine, and she found she did not have a simple or particularly professional answer ready for it, because the real answer was something that had been growing in her for 3 weeks like a plant that grows in unexpected places, and then one morning you look and it is substantial and you cannot remember exactly when it began. "Because the arrangement is fair and correct," she said, "and because what you have built here deserves the chance you earned for it." She paused. "And because your children need their home." Homer looked at her for a long time across the pine table, and she met his gaze without looking away, which required a small but genuine effort. "Thank you," he said, the same way he had said it about Clara, quiet and complete and meaning more than the words carried. That afternoon he rode with her partway back to town, saying he needed to check on a section of fence near the road, which Sable could have checked and which both of them knew was not the real reason. They rode slowly, the horses in that close, easy step they always fell into now, and the afternoon light was doing what Clara had apparently always loved about this land, pouring across the grass in rivers of gold, and they did not talk much, but the silence between them had changed again, was something richer and more complicated now, full of things that had not yet been said. At the junction where the road to town branched away from the fence line he would have ridden, they stopped their horses and sat for a moment that stretched beyond any practical reason for sitting. He said, "You could eat supper at the house if you are not in a hurry back to town." She said, "I am not in a hurry." Supper that night was a beef stew that Homer made while Matilda sat at the kitchen table reading James a story from a small, battered picture book about a mountain and a bear. And Pearl sat on the floor building a tower from wooden blocks with the focused intensity of an engineer. Sable ate with them as he always did, saying little but present in the way that made the table feel complete. And after the children had been put to bed and Sable had gone to his room in the smaller outbuilding, there was a long, quiet hour at the table with the lamp burning low and 2 cups of somewhat better coffee than usual, because Homer had apparently gotten a fresh supply from the general store. They talked about books, about the geological survey, about the land further west that the surveys described in terms both of them found alternately plausible and fantastic. They talked about San Antonio, which Matilda knew well and Homer had visited only twice, both times for business. They talked about the drive coming up in June, the route and the expected prices, and the particular challenges of this year's herd size. And gradually, the conversation slowed and deepened in the way that conversations do when the people having them have moved past the surface and are not in a hurry to find it again. At some point in the evening, Matilda said, not looking directly at him, looking instead at the lamp flame with the slightly unfocused gaze of someone thinking out loud, "I have been very good at being useful in a defined capacity. I am less practiced at being present in an undefined one." Homer turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. He said, without looking at her either, "I have been very good at being present in a defined grief. I am less practiced at being present in anything else." A pause. Outside, the night was full of cricket sound and the distant call of something nocturnal. "That seems like a shared difficulty," said Matilda. "It does," said Homer. He looked at her then, and she looked at him, and what passed between them in that moment was not yet words, but it was unambiguous, the kind of look that constitutes its own form of declaration, the kind that cannot be retracted or misread once it has been given. She rode back to town later than she should have, in the full dark, Clover picking her way along the familiar road with the instinctive confidence of a horse that had made this trip many times. Matilda sat loose in the saddle and looked up at the enormous Texas sky, thick with stars in the way that is only possible far from any town, and she felt something inside her that she could not name. She was a practical woman. She was a professional woman. She had a debt to collect and a duty to her employer and a life, and a set of habits in San Antonio that constituted, if not exactly happiness, a solid and workable contentment. And she admitted to herself somewhere under those Texas stars, deeply and thoroughly unsettled by a tall man with dark hair and a limestone house and two small children and a shelf of books, and a habit of making terrible coffee and watching the evening light fall across his land like it was the most important thing in the world. She owed him something she could not name. That was the plainest way she could put it to herself. It was not the money, not the professional extension, not the conversation with Cass, though all of those were part of it. It was something more essential and less categorizable, the feeling of being in his presence and finding it a place she wanted to stay. Delbert Cass left Dusty Creek 2 days later. He had been seen having a drink with the town's only lawyer, and then riding out early on a Friday morning. And whether he had decided the obstacle was too entrenched or had some other plan forming in his distant office, Matilda could not be certain. She wrote a careful note in her weekly report to Pierce mentioning the approach he had made and the firm rebuff she had provided, and she asked Pierce explicitly not to entertain any offer on the note from a man named Cass should he come calling. Pierce wrote back the following week, tersely but clearly, that he had received no such approach and would decline it if he did, that he preferred to collect his own debts in full, and that Matilda should continue as planned. The cattle drive was scheduled for the 17th of June, and as it approached, the property took on the particular charged energy of a large undertaking in the final stages of preparation. 3 additional hands arrived, young men Homer had worked with for the past 2 years, names that came with faces Matilda learned quickly, because it was her habit to learn faces and names quickly. They were respectful of her presence in a careful way that told her Homer had said something to them that accounted for her without requiring explanation. The night before the drive left, she stayed at the property because the preparations ran late, and the practicalities of riding back to town and returning at dawn simply did not make sense. Homer gave her the guest room, a small but tidy space at the top of the stairs that looked east over the pasture land, and she lay in the narrow bed under a quilt that smelled of cedar and listened to the house settle around her. She was up at first light and in the kitchen making coffee, which she made better than Homer did, because she had asked Mrs. Finch the previous week for the secret, and Mrs. Finch had told her, with the satisfied air of someone whose expertise had finally been recognized, that the secret was a pinch of salt in the grounds. She had the coffee ready when Homer came down the stairs in the gray pre-dawn, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her for a moment with an expression she was learning to read, which was the expression of a man being surprised by something pleasant in a world where he had come to expect most surprises to be the other kind. "You made coffee," he said. "I made better coffee than you make," she said. He tasted it and looked at her again. "How did you do that?" "Salt in the grounds," she said. "Mrs. Finch told me." He laughed, which was the first time she had heard him actually laugh, and it was brief and surprised, like something that escaped before he could decide whether to allow it, and she felt it in her chest like a struck match. The drive left at sunrise, Homer and Sable, and the 3 hands moving 300 head of cattle out through the east gate and north along the cattle road to the rail junction at a town called Merton, a 4-day trip. Mrs. Finch came to stay with the children, who stood at the fence and watched their father go with the solemn, trusting faces of children who understood absence without fully understanding why it was necessary. Matilda stayed. She told herself she stayed because the terms of the collection required her presence to monitor the asset situation. This was, technically, documented in the Pierce extension agreement. It was also not entirely the reason. She helped Mrs. Finch with the children, which was not part of any professional arrangement, but which she did anyway with a naturalness that surprised her. She rode out with Sable's nephew, a quiet young man named Tobias who had come from the next county to mind the property during the drive, to check the fences and the stock tank levels. She read to James in the evenings and let Pearl fall asleep against her shoulder in the kitchen chair with the lamp burning low, and she thought about the thing she could not name that she owed Homer Malone, and whether it was possible that what she owed him was herself, or at least the possibility of herself in the context of this particular life. She had come here to collect a debt. She was beginning to understand that she had incurred one. Homer returned on the 21st of June with Sable and the hands, dusty and tired and quieter than he had left, but with a settled satisfaction underneath the tiredness that she recognized as the look of a man who had accomplished something real. The prices at Merton had been good, better than expected. He had the full balance in a bank draft, $240, plus the small additional interest the Pierce agreement called for, drawn on the Merton Bank and valid at any institution in the state. He handed her the draft at the kitchen table the evening of his return, after the children had been put to bed, and Matilda looked at it for a moment before she reached for it. The figure was correct. The signatures were proper. Everything was in order. She put the draft in her ledger and wrote the notation that closed the account, and there was a finality to the scratch of the pen on the paper that was at once professionally satisfying and personally devastating in a small, quiet way she was not prepared for. The debt was settled. Her professional reason for being here was gone. Homer was watching her write. He said when she set the pen down, "I suppose this concludes your business." "Yes," she said. Her voice was very steady, which cost her more than it should have. The lamp between them burned with its soft, unsteady light. Outside, the summer night was warm and close, the first cicadas of the season singing in the dark. Homer looked at the table, then he looked at her. "I would ask you to stay," he said, "not on a professional basis." He paused. "But I am aware that you have a life in San Antonio and a position, and that I am a man with a cattle ranch and 2 small children and no particular right to ask anything of you." Matilda looked at him across the table and felt the whole weight of the thing she could not name pressing against the inside of her chest. "You are not asking me to give anything up," she said carefully. "You are asking me to consider whether what I want is something different from what I have." She paused. "That is not nothing, but it is also not an imposition." "What do you want?" he asked. The question was direct and honest and gave her nowhere to hide. She thought about the narrow hotel room in San Antonio. She thought about the steady procession of debtors and ledgers and roads. She thought about her mother's grave in the Austin cemetery and how movement had kept the grief manageable but had never resolved it. She thought about Pearl falling asleep against her shoulder and James's gap-toothed grin and Sable's dry, quiet humor and the South Ridge in the evening light, and the coffee she had made at dawn before the drive left, and the way Homer Malone laughed when something surprised him. "I want to stay," she said. "I do not know the full shape of what that means yet. But I want to stay." He reached across the table and his hand covered hers, large and warm and calloused from the work of the land, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a long moment in the lamplight with the cicadas singing outside, and it was not a small thing at all. She rode back to town that night and wrote to Amos Pierce, "The debt is collected in full, and I will be returning by the end of the week to file the closing documentation." And then she sat with the pen in her hand for a while longer and wrote a second letter, this one much harder to compose, in which she told Pierce that she was tendering her resignation, effective after the filing of the final report, and that she was grateful for the 3 years of employment, and that she wished him well. She read it twice, then sealed it before she could change her mind. In the morning, she rode out to the property and found Homer at the corral, watching one of the horses work, and she told him what she had decided and he listened. And when she was finished, he looked at her with an expression she could now read completely, which was the expression of a man who had been given something he had not quite dared to believe was coming. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I am not entirely certain of anything," she said honestly. "But I am more certain of this than I am of most other available options." He smiled properly this time, not the brief escaped laugh of the kitchen, but a full, open smile that changed his face entirely, and made her feel, once again, like something had been lit in the vicinity of her sternum. "I should say," he said, "that I have been in love with you since approximately the second week of your stay, and I have been trying to determine the appropriate way to address that fact while you were still professionally engaged, and I was professionally your subject, which seemed like a conflict of interest of some magnitude." Matilda burst out laughing, which surprised them both, and she pressed her hand over her mouth and said, "You have been thinking about conflicts of interest." "A great deal," he said solemnly, and the solemnity made her laugh again. "The conflict of interest is resolved," she said. "The debt is paid. Then I would very much like to court you properly," he said, "if you are agreeable." "I am agreeable," she said. Summer moved through its long, golden days, and she learned the rhythm of the ranch, not as a visitor but as a participant. There was a great deal to learn, and she was not too proud to be taught, and there was also a great deal she brought that the ranch had been lacking: an organized approach to the financial records, a clear-eyed assessment of which expenses were necessary and which were habitual, a network of contacts in San Antonio that turned out to be useful when it came time to negotiate the fall supply contracts. She and Homer courted in the old, specific way that the word implies, with rides and evenings and conversation, and the gradual, careful process of two people who have both been alone and both been hurt learning to trust the ground between them. There was nothing reckless about it. They were not young in the way of people who have not yet learned what loss costs. They were deliberate and honest and attentive to each other in the way of people who know that the good things require tending. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in August, on the South Ridge, with the light doing exactly what Clara had always loved, and said it would do, and it was quiet and certain and entirely unlike any kind of uncertainty. She went to San Antonio in September to file the closing Pierce paperwork and settle her affairs there, to vacate her rented room and collect the small accumulation of her belongings. And the 3 days she was gone felt, to both of them, considerably longer than they should have for people who had only known each other for months. She rode back to Dusty Creek on a Thursday afternoon, and James ran out to the gate when he heard her horse and shouted her name, and Pearl stood beside him with her arms held up. And that welcome, from those two small people at that gate, struck her somewhere deep and irreversible. Homer married her on the 4th of October, 1874, in the Dusty Creek church with the crooked steeple, in the presence of Sable and Mrs. Finch, and the 3 drive hands and the old general store man, and a respectable number of people from town who had apparently been watching the development with the invested interest of a small community that does not have a great deal of entertainment and has been waiting for something to conclude. The ceremony was brief and simple and conducted by the town's reverend, a young man of serious manner who had clearly prepared carefully and was earnest in all the right ways. Matilda wore a dress she had bought in San Antonio, a deep blue that Mrs. Finch said made her eyes look more blue than gray, which was not accurate but was kind. Homer wore his good coat and had clearly made an effort with his hair, which Pearl had apparently been involved in, based on the way it sat. When the Reverend said the words that completed the thing, Homer looked at Matilda with an expression she had been learning all summer and still found new dimensions in, and she looked back at him with the full force of everything she had felt in that kitchen on that first night, and on the South Ridge and under the stars, and in all the mornings and evenings between, and the thing she had been unable to name settled into something she could hold. It was love. The particular, adult, hard-won kind that comes from choosing deliberately and knowing the cost. The first winter of their marriage was the kind of winter that becomes a story, a genuine blue northern December that came down from the Panhandle and put 2 feet of snow on the Dusty Creek Valley, which snow was so unusual for that part of Texas that people would still talk about it 20 years later. They were snowbound for 4 days, the 5 of them plus Sable and Mrs. Finch, who had been caught at the property when the storm hit, and the house was warm and full with the noise of children and the smell of wood smoke and the particular comfortable pressure of too many people in a space that was just barely adequate. And Matilda thought, more than once across those 4 days, that she had never in her life been more purely glad of exactly where she was. She and Homer sat up late on the second night after the children and Mrs. Finch were asleep, the fire burning down to coals, the snow blue and deep outside the window, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him and they looked at the fire and said very little, because very little needed saying. "I cannot thank you for collecting my debt," he said at some point in the comfortable silence, "because that sounds like I am suggesting the debt collection was the good part." "The debt collection was the beginning," she said. "The good part is everything after it." "Everything after it," he agreed quietly. In the spring of 1875, Matilda began teaching at the small Dusty Creek schoolhouse 2 mornings a week, because the town had been without regular schooling for 2 years, and she had both the time and the education for it, and because James was of school age, and she found the work genuinely satisfying in a different way than the collection work had been, building something in people rather than retrieving something from them. The classroom was drafty and the materials were scarce, and the children were a collection of every personality the territory had to offer, and she loved it with the fierce, practical love she tended to bring to things she committed to. In the late summer of 1875, she realized she was expecting a child. She told Homer on a quiet evening after supper, while the children were playing in the fading garden light and Sable had gone in early for the night. She did not lead up to it with any particular ceremony. She said, "I believe we are going to have a child in the spring." Homer went very still, and in his stillness she felt the presence of something very large, the grief of the loss of Clara, the fear that lived in any man who had already lost his wife to childbed fever, and the joy underneath all of that, working its way through. He reached for her hand and she gave it to him, and he held it with a steadiness that told her he had decided, consciously and deliberately, to meet what was coming with the full open courage of a man who had learned what it cost to close himself off from the world. "We will take good care," he said, "of you, of all of us." "I know," she said, and she did know. She had no fear about it in the sharp, practical way that she had no fear about most things that could be addressed by preparation and attention. There was a good doctor in Merton now, a recent arrival from the East who had trained properly and knew his medicine. She had already made a mental note of this. Their son was born on a clear morning in March of 1876, in the limestone house, with the good doctor from Merton in attendance, and Mrs. Finch beside her and Homer, outside the door wearing a hole in the hallway floorboards with his pacing. The labor was long and hard and fully successful, and when the baby announced himself to the world with the full force of what turned out to be an extremely powerful pair of lungs, Homer came through the door with the eyes of a man who had been holding his breath for approximately 8 hours. He was placed in Homer's arms, dark-haired and furious, already composed of opinions, and Homer held him with the practiced care of a man who had held babies before but held this one differently, with the particular reverence of a thing that has survived an enormous fear. "What shall we call him?" Homer asked, looking at Matilda. She was tired in a way that went to the bottom of her, and she looked at this dark-haired, loud, certain child and thought of everything that had brought them all to this particular morning. "William," she said, "after no one in particular, just because it suits him." Homer smiled the full, open smile that she still, after nearly 2 years, found she could not quite prepare herself for. "William Malone," he said. "Good morning." William had a great deal to say in response to this, most of it immediate and urgent, and the room filled with the sound of new life doing what new life does. And James and Pearl were called in carefully to meet their brother. And James looked at him with the calculating eyes of a 6-year-old assessing a new variable in his world. And Pearl immediately declared him beautiful in the clear, authoritative tone she had apparently inherited from her father. And outside the bedroom window the March sun was pouring across the Texas grassland in rivers of gold. Sable stood in the doorway, looked at the room, looked at Matilda, and said, with the quiet certainty of his particular authority, "Good." That single word covered everything. The years that followed were full in the way that lives become full when they are lived well and without reservation. The cattle operation grew steadily and sensibly, not with the reckless ambition that leads to ruin, but with the patient accumulation that leads to permanence. The school where Matilda taught expanded to 3 mornings a week, and then to 5 full days when Dusty Creek grew large enough to justify it, and a second teacher arrived from out east. Matilda stayed involved even as her role evolved, eventually sitting on the small school board and advocating, with the quiet, firm effectiveness that characterized everything she did, for the children of the Comanche and Mexican families that lived in and around the territory to have equal access to the school, which was not a simple or uncontested position in 1877 in that part of Texas, but which she held and pressed consistently until it became, in practical if not always in spirit, the operating reality. Sable, who had watched this campaign with the same calm attention he brought to everything, told her one afternoon while they were mending the north fence, "My sister's granddaughter will be able to go to school here because of you." Matilda did not make a fuss of this, because she understood it was not a compliment but a fact, and Sable was not in the habit of compliments but had never been known to misstate a fact. "Good," she said, in his own word, and they went back to the fence. James grew into a serious, capable boy who had both his father's strength and his mother's quickness, and who took to the cattle work with a natural aptitude that made Homer's eyes go quietly proud every time he watched the boy work the herd. Pearl was clever and singular and had long since stopped being small, having grown into a girl who could outride every child in the county and had read every book on the family shelf twice, and who had expressed, with complete confidence, her intention of becoming a doctor, which was not an easy thing for a girl in 1878, but which no one in the Malone household was going to be the one to tell her was impossible. William was something else entirely. He was loud and determined, and had from approximately the age of 3 shown a passionate interest in horses that went beyond anything practical and into the territory of genuine, insistent love. And by the age of 2, he had apparently tried to climb into the corral with the horses on 4 separate occasions, each of which had produced a full household emergency, and which Sable had responded to by beginning, calmly and systematically, to teach the child to handle horses correctly before the child killed himself through enthusiasm. In the autumn of 1878, when William was 2.5 and Pearl was 7, and James was 9, Matilda discovered she was expecting again, and she told Homer on the South Ridge in the evening, which felt like the right place for announcements of significance, and he responded by holding her close and saying, very quietly, that he was the most fortunate man in Texas, which she received with the particular, private warmth she reserved for things that were completely and genuinely true. Their daughter arrived in May of 1879, easier than William had been, born in the growing warmth of a Texas spring morning with the windows open and the smell of the garden coming through. They named her Ruth, which had been Matilda's mother's name, and Homer held her with the same reverence he had held all of them, and she was dark-eyed and quiet in a way that reminded Matilda already of Pearl's earliest particular solemnity. The family filled the limestone house in the way that families fill spaces, not with disorder, but with the specific, living presence of people who belong to a place and know it. The pine table at which Matilda had first laid out her ledger and her professional purpose was now the table where homework was done, and arguments were conducted and meals were taken and plans were made. The bookshelves had expanded to a second case that Homer had built along the east wall, and Matilda's books had joined his, and the whole collection had the satisfying randomness of two people's intellectual lives mingled without hierarchy. On a Sunday evening in the summer of 1880, 6 years after Matilda had ridden into Dusty Creek on a bay mare with a ledger and a loaded pistol, and a professional indifference she had managed to sustain for approximately 2 weeks, she sat on the front porch of the limestone house in the long evening light with Homer beside her, and watched the 4 children in the front yard. James, now 11, was showing William, who was 4 in all intensity, how to properly throw a rope, with the patient elder brother's seriousness he brought to all instructional tasks. Pearl, 9 and already half a head taller than she had been last summer, was reading in the patch of shade by the garden fence with the absolute concentration that reading apparently required of her. Ruth, 1 year old, was sitting in the patch of grass between the porch steps and the garden, examining a blade of grass with the focused wonder of someone encountering the concept of grass for the first time. Sable came around the corner of the barn, moving in his unhurried way, looked at the yard, looked at the porch, gave a nod that covered all of it, and went inside, because supper would need starting and he had decided somewhere around 1875 that starting supper was his territory, and he defended it with quiet authority. Homer's hand found Matilda's on the porch rail between them, as it had found it across 1,000 different surfaces over the years, and she turned her hand and held his with the same sureness she had felt the first time in that lamplight kitchen, when the debt had been settled and everything else had just begun. "Do you know," she said, looking out at the yard and the children and the land going golden in the long evening, "I was so certain when I rode out here that I understood exactly what I was doing and why." "Collecting a debt," he said. "Collecting a debt," she agreed. "And I was very good at it. I had a method and a record and a professional purpose, and I did not deviate from any of it." She paused. "For approximately 2 weeks." He laughed quietly. "What happened at the end of 2 weeks?" She thought about the evenings on the South Ridge. She thought about Pearl leaning against her leg in the garden. She thought about the kitchen lamp and the cicadas and the coffee with salt in the grounds, and the thing she had felt under the stars on the ride home that she could not name and later came to understand was the simple, total recognition of where she belonged. "I owed you something I could not name," she said, "and I understood at some point that the only way to settle it properly was to stay." Homer was quiet for a moment. Below them, William had gotten the rope tangled and James was patiently untangling it, and Ruth had moved on from the blade of grass to a small stone, and Pearl had put down her book and was watching her sister with a soft expression that made her look very much like someone Matilda loved. "I am glad you stayed," he said. "So am I," said Matilda. "Every single day." The evening light fell across the Texas grassland in rivers of gold, and the limestone house sat solid and permanent in the heart of it, and the children's voices rose and fell in the warm air, and the world was exactly the size and shape of everything that mattered, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was home. Ruth looked up from her stone and found Matilda watching her, and gave a slow, enormous smile that had her father's whole face quality, and reached both arms up in the universal language of a small person who wishes to be held. Matilda went down the porch steps and picked her up and held her warm and solid against her shoulder, and Ruth immediately lost interest in being held and became interested instead in the buttons on Matilda's collar, which she began examining with professional thoroughness. Homer watched them from the porch, and his expression was the one she knew best of all his expressions, the one that was not complicated or reserved or carrying the weight of any grief, the one that was simply and completely present in the life he had, the one that was love. She looked back at him over Ruth's dark head, and smiled, and that was the whole of it, the debt fully paid on both sides, the ledger closed, the long, golden evening stretching before them with all its ordinary and extraordinary promise, and Dusty Creek settling quietly into the coming dusk around them. And the only sound in the world worth hearing was the sound of their family alive and whole in the last light of a perfect Texas day.